All right, so I think it's time for us to get started. Welcome everyone who's logged on so far. My name is Dr. Amy Catherine Medvick, and I'm the Director of Educational Programming here at Hermann-Grima and Gallier Historic Houses. For those who are new, Hermann-Grima and Gallier Historic Houses, managed by the Women's Exchange, preserves two 19th century New Orleans homes, and through their architecture, collections, and history, inspires discourse about our collective past and its relevance to our present and future. We invite you to come visit us next time you are in the French Quarter. This event is made possible by funding from the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities. Funding for 2021 Rebirth grants has been administered by the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities and provided by the National Endowment for the Humanities as part of the American Rescue Plan and the NEH Sustaining the Humanities through the American Rescue Plan Initiative. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of the National Endowment for the Humanities. It is my great honor this evening to introduce our speaker. Dr. Jonathan Michael Square is the Assistant Professor of Black Visual Culture at Parsons School of Design. He has taught at the University of Pennsylvania, Fashion Institute of Technology, and most recently, Harvard University. He has a PhD from New York University, an MA from the University of Texas at Austin, and a BA from Cornell University. A proponent in the power of social media as a platform for radical pedagogy, he founded and runs the digital humanities project, Fashioning the Self in Slavery and Freedom, which explores the intersection of fashion and slavery. At tonight's Gallier gathering, Dr. Square will present a chapter from his book manuscript that explores the intersection of fashion and dress with the system of slavery in the United States. In this talk, titled "A Stain on an All-American Brand, How Brooks Brothers Once Clothed Enslaved People," Dr. Square will explore the structure of the Brooks Brothers business, extant examples of Brooks Brothers supplied clothing, and Brooks Brothers' appeals to Southern clients to pay outstanding bills as evidence of its connection to the peculiar institution. This story has a peculiar relationship to the French Quarter, which will be elaborated in depth in the talk. We will be holding a Q&A at the end of his lecture. So you can type your questions in the Q&A section. It's a separate section from the chat section. You can add those throughout the lecture and we will address them once he's finished his talk. So without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Dr. Jonathan Michael Square.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Medvick, for that introduction. It's an honor and pleasure to be here. Can everyone hear me? How's my audio? Okay, awesome. Yeah, I'm really happy to be here for two reasons. One, I am a native of Louisiana. I'm a proud Louisianan, and this is the first time I've actually presented my research in Louisiana. I'm not in Louisiana in person. I live in Brooklyn full time, but I was born and raised in Louisiana. So it's really an honor and pleasure to be able to present this research at an institution that's based in Louisiana. Also, as you'll learn in my talk, this research has a connection to the French Quarter. So it makes a lot of sense to present this research at Hermann-Grima because it's only a stone's throw away from where part of this research was located. So I am going to share my screen. Okay. So the title of my talk, "A Stain on an All-American Brand, How Brooks Brothers Once Clothed Enslaved People." You know, many people have heard of the company Brooks Brothers. You know, it has a lot of brand recognition, name recognition, but many people don't realize that the company has a connection to slavery. Brooks Brothers was founded in 1818, so it's over 200 years old. And many things that are that old often have a connection to slavery. So this research sort of unpacks that connection before I talk about my research, I want to talk a little bit more about myself. Um, as Dr. Medvik said in her introduction, I'm currently the assistant professor of Black visual culture at Parsons School of Design. I'm also a curatorial fellow at the Costume Institute at the Met, and I founded and run the Digital Humanities Project, Fashioning the Self in Slavery and Freedom. And I have to say, I'm quite honored. This part of my research is featured in the current show, fashion exhibition that's at the Met right now, called In Fashion, an Anthology of, in America, sorry, an Anthology of Fashion. And one of the first rooms that you walk in the exhibition, there are two Brooks Brothers coats that are on display. One of them, the one that I'm looking at in the photo on the right, was worn by an enslaved man. This is one of the coats that's the focus of my research. It's in the permanent collection of the Historic New Orleans Collection. And I'm really honored that this part of my research is being featured in the current Met exhibition. As Amy said, I run the Digital Humanities Project, Fashioning the Self in Slavery and Freedom, and I often share many of my research findings and just anything sort of that deals with Black visual culture, Black fashion, connections between slavery and the fashion system through this platform, which lives primarily on social media, though I have done some in-person events, and I publish a limited run zine that's inspired by the project. But what I'm presenting today is actually part of a book manuscript that I'm currently working on. And there's several parts of the book. There's another chapter that's also very New Orleans focused on head wraps worn by free and enslaved women of color. I have another chapter on W.E.B. Du Bois and his style evolution. I have another chapter on Negro Cloth, which was a textile that was manufactured specifically for enslaved people. Then I have another chapter that's on an understudied figure. Her name was Mary Jones. She was a Black trans sex worker who worked in New York City in the early 19th century. And I use descriptions of her dress to sort of unpack details about her life. So often when I tell people that I study fashion and slavery, the reaction is, well, didn't enslaved people just wear rags? And they most certainly did, but it's a little more complicated than just that. Moreover, when people think about slavery in the transatlantic slave trade, they don't necessarily associate it with fashion. You know, when we think about fashion, we think about positive things, whether it's creativity, autonomy, self-determination. Fashion is often even associated with democracy. And slavery, of course, is the antithesis of that. You know, it's the deprivation of freedom and selfhood. Despite that, enslaved people in the US and actually across the Atlantic Basin use fashion to fight for greater freedom and express their multifarious identities. So how exactly did enslaved people gain a more elaborate wardrobe? Well, there are a number of means by which they did so. For one, enslaved people received sort of shapeless, ready-made garments that they were able to modify and tailor to their bodies. They also received bolts of shoddily made undyed cotton and linen that's often referred to as Negro cloth. So I have a chapter, the first chapter of my book actually, is on Negro cloth. And with this Negro cloth, enslaved people were tasked with sort of hand sewing their own garments. Often that was an enslaved person, typically an enslaved woman, who was tasked with making clothing for other enslaved people. These fabrics were often dyed with natural dyes. So through hand sewing and tailoring and dyeing, enslaved people were able to sort of express their individuality. Another means by which enslaved people sort of got more elaborate wardrobes was through just purchasing more clothing. So many enslaved people worked on the weekends. Sunday was typically a day off, or even at night. Um, Sometimes it was work on other properties nearby the plantation. Sometimes they had small plots of land. They were called provision grounds, which they produced um, produce. Sometimes they raised poultry, hunted, fished, and engaged in artisanal work. So enslaved people were able to make small amounts of money from extra work that they did. And with the small amounts of money, sometimes they would buy clothing and accessories. Sometimes they just were able to buy more food or liquor just to supplement their diets. Another way in which enslaved people gained more elaborate wardrobes was through the secondhand clothing market. Um, so enslaved people bought, sold, and bartered garments. And if you read runaway slave ads, there's often very lengthy descriptions, not only of how enslaved people were dressed when they ran away, but also the clothing that they took with them. And it's because, in the 18th and even in the 19th centuries, there wasn't a lot of paper money and coins being circulated. Clothing was often used as a form of currency. And so enslaved people not only stole their own wardrobes, but sometimes stole their enslavers' wardrobes to barter for passage or lodging or food. Enslaved people also received cast-offs from their enslavers. And lastly, occasionally enslaved people, and particularly enslaved domestics, are favorited and are productive enslaved people, received fine garments that was manufactured in Europe and in the Northeast, which is the case of the Brooks Brothers coats that are the focus of this talk. But before I talk about those coats, I want to talk about just Brooks Brothers in general. It's a curious brand. As I mentioned, it's over 200 years old. And it's a brand that's often associated with the American presidency, which is why I'm showing you this photo. Of course, this is from Donald Trump's inauguration. And what really strikes me about this photo is Donald Trump and Barack Obama have very little in common, but they're almost dressed identically in this photo. And they're both wearing Brooks Brothers coats, um, almost identical Brooks Brothers coats. And the only thing that's different about their dress is a pin that Barack Obama is wearing. I'm not sure what that pin says, and the color of their ties, which I think sort of probably reflects their political affiliations. Okay, so this is the moment in which I test your knowledge of American history. So 40 out of 46 presidents have been officially outfitted by Brooks Brothers. Um, and if you want, maybe you can, in a chat, if you can identify the 6 presidents that are missing from this list. I'll give you 5 or 10 seconds to sort of scan this list, and maybe you can identify the presidents that are missing. So if you remember, Brooks Brothers was founded in 1818. So the first 3 presidents weren't able to be outfitted by Brooks Brothers. So of course, John Adams, George Washington, and Thomas Jefferson are missing from the list. 2 other presidents that are missing are Ronald Reagan and Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter was very thrifty, and when he became president, he chose not to be outfitted by Brooks Brothers because he had suits that he already liked and wore. So he's a president who wasn't officially dressed by Brooks Brothers. Ronald Reagan, as we know, was an actor before he went into politics. Many of his sort of tailors and connections to fashion were based in California. And Brooks Brothers is a brand that's often associated with the Northeast. So when he became president, he kept all those connections that he had in California and chose not to be outfitted by Brooks Brothers. The last president, of course, is our current president, Joe Biden. Joe Biden actually has shopped at Brooks Brothers, but he hasn't been officially outfitted by Brooks Brothers. And on his inauguration, he actually wore Ralph Lauren, which is another very important and very interesting American brand. His go-to brand is Ralph Lauren, so he didn't wear Brooks Brothers in his inauguration. But in my research, I have found that he has shopped at Brooks Brothers in the past before he was president. But the point of this slide is to show you how much Brooks Brothers is embedded in thinking about the American presidency. You know, Abraham Lincoln was wearing a Brooks Brothers coat when he was assassinated, and actually in the Met exhibition in fashion in America, an anthology of fashion, the Brooks Brothers coat that was worn by an enslaved man is actually displayed alongside the Brooks Brothers coat that Abraham Lincoln was wearing when he was assassinated. JFK was actually wearing a Brooks Brothers button-up shirt when he was also assassinated. You know, FDR famously wore a Brooks Brothers greatcoat to the Jaffa conference. Teddy Roosevelt, you know, when he was part of the Rough Riders, wore a Brooks Brothers uniform. So it's a brand that has a close connection to the American presidency. That's important because Brooks Brothers, many American presidents were also enslavers. So looking at the same list, if you had to guess, how many of these presidents also owned enslaved people? About a third. Pretty much the entire first column of presidents were also enslavers, with the exception of John Quincy Adams, who of course was famously an abolitionist. Same with, and think going to the next column, Andrew Johnson owned enslaved people before he was president, and Grant also owned enslaved people. So roughly a third of all American presidents have also been enslavers. So just thinking about two institutions, the American presidency and the institution of slavery, and an institution like Brooks Brothers, all of these institutions have connections to slavery. Okay, so these are the two coats that are the focus of this talk and the focus of the chapter that I'm in the process of writing. As I mentioned, they are in the permanent collection of the Historic New Orleans collection. And the coat on the right is actually on display currently at the Met. They were purchased by a man named William Newton Mercer. And William Newton Mercer was born in Baltimore in the late 18th century and born into a very wealthy family. He studied at the University of Pennsylvania. He studied medicine. And after graduating, he enlisted in the Army as a surgeon. He was first stationed in New Orleans and then later in Natchez. And in the Natchez, he married into a very wealthy planter family. And when he married into this planter family, once his father-in-law and mother-in-law, and also his wife passed away, he sort of inherited the wealth of this very wealthy family. They owned 4 plantations in Adams County, Mississippi. And so, you know, he already came from a wealthy family, did very well for himself as a surgeon in the US Army. But then once he inherited his family's 4 plantations, he became astronomically wealthy, like in the top 1% of enslaving people in the American South. He was so prominent that I've gone through his papers, which are archived at LSU. And there's correspondence between him and Abraham Lincoln. So he he rubbed shoulders and corresponded with some very prominent individuals. He also served as the president of the Bank of Louisiana for a few years. So an extremely wealthy man, large disposable income. So you can understand why he might purchase custom jackets for his enslaved manservants. So this is just a short video of, I've of course seen the jackets in person. This is Rebecca Smith and Jason Weiss of Historic New Orleans Collection. If you happen to be watching, or anyone from the Historic New Orleans Collection is watching, shouts out to you all. Thank you so much for helping me in my research. It's just a short video just to give you some perspective of how the coats look and how they feel. This actual quote is quite small. Even though I said manservant, I suspect that the person who wore this coat was a child or adolescent based on the size of the coat. So as I said, I've been able to go through William Newton Mercer's papers, which are quite extensive. They're archived at Louisiana State University. And this, as you might guess, is an inventory of enslaved people. As I mentioned, he owned 4 plantations. The list, as you can see, is separated into 4 different parts. Let's see, there's Ormond, Buckhurst, Ellis Cliff, Laurel Hill, and there's a final tally here. And as you can see, there's X's and O's to, as you can see, this from 1865. And so actually, these enslaved people were technically free. There's a lot of documentation in his papers around this era. There was an attempt to like maintain order on a plantation. There's a lot of documents relating to who chose to stay on the plantation, who decided to leave because they were technically free at this moment and could leave. And so that's what these X's and O's stand for. Also, if you look towards the right of this document, you'll see it's horned cattle and horses, mules, hogs, etc. And just speaks to the inhumanity of slavery, that individuals, human beings, were cataloged, inventoried alongside livestock. And of course, as I mentioned, this document is from 1865, so all the individuals on here are technically free. This also just speaks to the amount of wealth that he had wrapped up in enslaved people. William Newton Mercer was also very financially savvy, so a lot of his wealth was in his plantations and in enslaved people, but he also owned real estate across the US. He had financial interests in New York City and Newport, Rhode Island. So he diversified his portfolio. And so he was still quite wealthy after the Civil War. This is just a detailed shot of the inside of one of the coats. It's very faint, but you can see the very top of the label says Brooks Brothers, then Broadway, Grand Street, New York. And that was the second location of Brooks Brothers. The original location is on the corner of Catherine and Cherry Street. But I'll talk more about where Brooks Brothers was located in New York City later. This is a etching of William Newton Mercer. As you can see, he's a bit younger than where my research is focused. You can see it says 1837 here. My research is, the late 1850s, 1860s, when he was a bit older. You see him sort of middle-aged. If anyone is familiar with like New Orleans-based artists in the 19th century, this is a Jules Lion etching. So William Newton Mercer actually didn't spend much time in Natchez after his wife died. He moved to New Orleans and he settled in a mansion that's on Canal Street, and it still stands. It's now where the Boston Club is. The Boston Club is a private um, gentleman's club. So this is a modern photo of the Boston Club. It's on Canal Street. If anyone watching happens to be a member of the Boston Club, I would be curious to take a tour of this property. I don't think there's anything there that would sort of contribute in my research in any way. I imagine anything related to William Newton Mercer is either at Tulane or at the Historic New Orleans Collection. I'm just curious to see how the interior looks. So this is another document from William Newton Mercer's papers. As I said, he was a fastidious record keeper. And this is a receipt from 1865. William Newton Mercer was born in Maryland, studied in Pennsylvania, and he actually had a lot of connections in the Northeast, familial and financial. He wasn't in favor of secession from the Union. So he spent part of the Civil War in New York City for that reason. And this receipt is from his time in New York City. If you look at the very top of the receipt, you see it's from the firm of Charles P. Leverett. Charles P. Leverett was, at the time, what was referred to as a factor. I think in the 21st century, we would refer to them as either an accountant or a financial advisor. Charles P. Leverett was the go-to factor for wealthy planters in the South. And I think this document sort of reveals the intimate connection between the North and the South. Of course, in an older historiography, like in the 1950s, 1960s, slavery is sort of seen as like a thing of the American South, and that the Northeast had very loose connections to slavery. But I mean, I think this is one of many examples of like the intimate connection between New York City and the North and the American South, because Charles P. Leverett was based in New York. His brother had a satellite office in New Orleans, but the headquarters were in New York. And Charles P. Leverett also served as the president of the Bank of New York. So one of the people that managed William Newton Mercer's finances was Charles P. Leverett, or someone from Charles P. Leverett's firm. And so this is a receipt from Charles P. Leverett's firm of William Newton Mercer's expenses while he was in New York City. And I used a magnifying tool to sort of zero in on the purchases from Brooks Brothers. Now, I'm not sure if the coats that are the focus of this chapter and of this talk were purchased at this very moment, but this document does prove that William Newton Mercer was a repeat Brooks Brothers customer. This is another document that's from William Newton Mercer's papers. It's correspondence. As I said, Mercer wasn't present in Natchez, particularly towards the last few decades of his life. He lived in New Orleans in the mansion that I just showed you. And so the man who ran his plantations was this man named Wilbur Shields, who was also a small plantation owner himself, but he served as, and I'm using air quotes here, like a director of operations for Mercer's 4 plantations. So they had a running correspondence for years. They talked about crop yields and the weather, but also the behavior of enslaved or formerly enslaved people on those 4 plantations. And that's what this letter is about. So the first few lines reads, I propose to give the medals to Caesar, Ellen, Frank, and perhaps Bessie. They have been perfectly faithful to you, far more so than Johnson was when he was here. The medals coming from me would be but little value, but you greatly. So as you can see, he's proposing that Mercer, who at this time was actually still in New York, that he give medals to Caesar, Ellen, Bessie, and Frank, Frank and Bessie, because they've been perfectly faithful. And the reason I think this is an important document to contemplate is because I'm interested in the use of fashion and accessories to maintain order. So fashion is an incentive. As I said earlier in this talk, overseers, enslaved domestics, favorited and are productive enslaved persons sometimes receive fine clothing that was manufactured in the Northeast or Europe. So enslaved people were encouraged by a system of awards that included both hand-me-downs and new garments. And in the case of the document I just showed you, gold medals. Fashion was thus embedded in the system of awards and punishments that held plantations and slave societies. And in this case, former slave societies, because we're talking about 1865, post Emancipation Proclamation. So plantations, slave societies, and former slave societies run smoothly. Here is another example of what I just described. This is a newspaper article about a man named Peter Fawcett. It was published in 1898. Peter Fawcett was born and raised at Monticello. And the Fawcett family was similar to the Hemmings family in that there was a less social distance between the Jefferson family and the Hemmings and the Fawcetts. They served as domestics, butlers, laundresses. They worked inside the home of Monticello as opposed to in the field. Unlike the Hemmings family, which we know the Hemmings family intermarried within the Jefferson family. One Sally Hemings was Martha Jefferson's half-sister. And then Thomas Jefferson, of course, had a relationship with Sally Hemings. So the Hemings family is intertwined with the Jefferson family in the way that the Fawcett family isn't. But Peter Fawcett was born and raised in Monticello. And this is an article that's about his experience at Monticello. And of course, by 1898, he was quite elderly, as you can see in this photo of him right here. But the reason I'm showing you this article, but there's a part of the article where he talks about how he was dressed. He describes being dressed in fine clothing, unlike most of the other boys at Monticello, because he served as, a boy servant or valet to Thomas Jefferson, as you can see in this part right here. So there was a hierarchy amongst enslaved people on many plantations in which people who worked in close proximity to their enslavers were dressed in better clothing as opposed to people who were more engaged in more agricultural labor. So the two enslaved men, man and boy, who wore the Brooks Brothers coats, probably were working inside of